Welcome to the CSS3 project training series. This is the new features in CSS3, and in this tutorial we're actually going to talk about an overview of CSS3 and the border properties inside the new CSS3. So CSS3, what's the big deal? CSS3 is the latest standard for CSS or cascading style sheets. CSS3 is completely backwards compatible with the earlier versions of CSS. This tutorial will walk you through some of the new features of CSS3. There's going to be many parts to this tutorial series as we walk through the different features that are available now with CSS3 and a brief introduction as to how those new features work. CSS3 has been split into modules. It contains the old CSS specifications, which have then been split into smaller pieces. In addition, new modules are added to support new features. This new modular concept will make it much easier to support changes to the specification as they can be addressed in the individual modules instead of having to address the entire specification. This is actually going to make it a lot easier as updates from the W3C to the CSS3 specification are implemented. So let's discuss some of the most important module additions to CSS3. First, we have a lot of changes in the selectors and how they're addressed, and we're going to go through those. We've got changes to the box model and how we actually lay out our pages now in CSS3. Backgrounds and borders, a lot of new additions for backgrounds, a lot of new additional properties for borders. Image values and replaced content, a lot of new additions to those. We have now text effects that are built into CSS3, 2D and 3D transformations, animations, multiple column layouts, and user interface. There's a lot of new stuff in CSS3 that's going to make our designing of our web pages much simpler than it used to be with the older versions of CSS. Let's look at these new features individually, and that's what I plan to do with this series. We're going to go through individually and look at each one of the new features, give demonstrations in our lab exercises so you can see how they're implemented and how they work. And I think you'll really enjoy it because we're going to break them down individually so it's easier to understand as you go through and look at each new feature inside CSS3. The first thing we're going to look at is CSS3 borders. With CSS3, you can create rounded borders and shadows to boxes and use an image as a border without using graphics programs such as Fireworks. And that's a huge change from the older versions of CSS. We can do a lot of things now that we weren't able to do with CSS 2.1. In this demonstration, we're actually going to look at border radius, the box shadow, and border image. And browser support for these currently is where it's sitting. And again, as of this recording in March 2015, we have pretty good support across the spectrum for these border radius, box shadow. Still a little bit iffy on the border image, the way that the image is handled, but it's getting there. You're going to see as we go through the demonstration. But we have pretty good support across the spectrum for border radius, box shadow, and border image is getting to where it needs to be. So we're going to move into our development environment and demonstrate what we've been discussing on those new properties in CSS3. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize the presentation and drop down into my development environment. And the first thing I want to do is I want to confirm that my Apache server is up and running, which we are. That's good. Let's go ahead and bring up Google Chrome, which will be that browser I'm going to use for this demonstration, and Sublime Text 2, my text editor. And you'll see I'm in the CSS3_start.html file. We're actually going to be in the borders folder for the CSS3 in the event that you have access to the exercise files. And I'm going to load up the first to start. CSS3_start.html. You'll notice we have nothing on our stage because basically I've just got a generic HTML5 document. So the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this as example 1. So I'm going to save it as example_1.html inside that borders folder. And what I want to do is I want to go in and add some stuff to the body elements. So with CSS 2.1, which is the version that we're coming off of, adding rounded corners was very tricky. We had to create a graphic for each corner, and we had to add the image, and then we had to play around and get the things just positioned exactly right inside of our graphics, and it was a real pain. With the new CSS3, it's actually quite simple. I'm going to go ahead and add an H1 to my document, my body, and I'm just going to say CSS3 borders. I'm going to close out my H1. Then I'm going to come right below that. I'm going to add an article tag. Again, I'm using one of those new HTML5 tags. And inside the article tag, I'm just going to say this section will have rounded corners. And the only reason I'm really using the article tag is so I've got some way to identify inside my style tags what I'm actually styling. So I've got my opening article tag, this section will have rounded corners, my closing article tag, and my H1. I'm going to go ahead and save the change, refresh the browser window, and you'll see now that we should have, there we go. We've got that stuff inside of our browser now, the text that we just typed in. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some styling that's going to relate to these new rounded borders. So up here in my head section, I'm just going to open up a style tag. We could actually do this with an external style sheet, but I think it's going to be easier. Because we're only going to be working in small sections, it's easier if I just keep it on this one page so you can see things as we're doing them. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up my style tag, come down a few lines and close my style tag. And right in between there, I'm just going to address my article element. Open and closing curly braces, so we're just addressing the article element now that's inside the body. And because I want this to act as if it were inline, because we all know that the article element is a block level element in HTML, this first, I'm going to have this display as inline block. This has nothing to do with the way we're utilizing the rounding corners. I just don't want it to go edge to edge. So I want it to display as an inline block, and you'll see why when we get in there. I'm just going to add some padding to it also. So again, it displays it nice and cleanly in our screen. And then I want to do is I want to add a border. I'm going to add a border of 2 pixels, solid. My color is going to be F09, and that with a semicolon. And then here's where we're going to get into the border radius. I'm going to type in border radius, and let's just give it a 10 pixel border radius. Go ahead and save all those changes and refresh my browser window. And you can see now we have those nice rounded corners strictly from CSS. We never used to be able to do that. And by the way, the border radius is actually the shortcut for the 4 values, because we actually have border top left radius, border top right radius, border bottom right radius, and border bottom left radius. And I'll show you those in a minute, or I'll show you why we might want to use those in a minute. But you can see now it's very, very simple with the new CSS3 to add border radius to our rounded corners, I should say, or border radius corners, to our outlines or our borders inside of our elements, which is very, very cool. The only reason I put these in, I'm going to pull these out real quick so you can see why I did that. The only reason I put those 2 in, for anyone that's new to CSS, otherwise it's going to stretch across my entire screen because the article element is a block level element. So I basically just gave it a display property of inline block, so it'll only be as long as the text, and then I added the padding so that I'd actually have some space between the right, left, top, and bottom. And that's why I did that in the event you're new to CSS and you wondered, okay, why did we add those other 2 lines? It's just to make it a little bit cleaner for you to see on the screen. What's really cool is I don't have to use the shortcut, because the border dash radius is basically a shortcut, and it gives us the same 10 pixel rounding for each corner. But what if I wanted a border? I'm going to say, let's say border top left. So I'm going to say border dash top dash left dash radius. Then I put in my colon, because now what I'm doing is I'm actually addressing individual corners. And let's say that one's 10 pixel. Let's go ahead and save the change. Refresh the browser window. You'll notice now the only one that has the rounded corner is the top left corner. That's a way that you can individually address each individual element. If I wanted to do, let's say, I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Come down right below here and paste it. Suppose I wanted to do border, I don't want to do top right, let's do bottom left. Radius. And we'll do the same thing, we'll make another 10 pixels. Save that change. And now we have just the left side and the right side squared off. So you can do each individual corner, or you can actually just use the shortcut, which is what we had done in the first place, by just typing border radius, and then it gives that radius to all 4 of the corners based on the value that you put in. And then I have the radius on all 4 corners. One thing that I have found that I want to point out, one thing that I have found is kind of interesting that I have not seen documented anywhere, because most CSS has these shortcut abilities. And with the shortcut abilities, you can actually go like, for instance, I could go top and bottom 5 pixel and then left and right 10 pixel. And it actually does work with this border radius, but it doesn't work as you would expect. So when I refresh the browser window, this would normally, in a normal shortcut, the first value would be the top and bottom. The second value would be the left and right. And I'm talking about normal shortcuts, now I'm talking about the way we do paddings and margins and all that. But you'll notice here that the first value is actually the top left and the bottom right. And the second value actually is the top right and the bottom left. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And if you were to put them in individually, because you can actually do this with them also, then you'd have 4 individual, and you'll notice they're all different values. This is the top left, this is the bottom, top right, bottom left. So you can play around with them. It's kind of interesting in the way that the shortcut works, because there is no documentation, by the way, about doing that. It doesn't tell you anything about that inside the spec, but it does work. But anyway, that gives you a good idea how the border radius works. The next thing we're going to look at, let's go ahead and look at the box shadow in CSS3. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the box shadow in CSS3. It's another one of the new properties. I'm going to do a save as on this document. We're going to save this as example 2. Again, if you have access to the exercise files, we'll have copies of all these. I want to go ahead and change our coding in here a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and pull these styles out. I'm going to go ahead and pull out this information that I have inside the body. This will be our second example. I'm just going to go ahead and put an H2 in here. And this H2 is adding a box shadow to a section. I'm going to go ahead and close out the H2. Come down right below that, I'm just going to go ahead and put in a section element, which is another new element inside HTML5. Come down a couple of lines. Let's go ahead and close out our section element. Get rid of that. Don't know where that came from. And then inside here, I'm just going to go ahead and put a P tag and adding a box shadow. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this so you don't have to watch me type it. I'll copy this from my exercise files. Let's go ahead and paste this in place, or paste this in. Close out that P tag. And basically all it says is adding box shadows used to be a very complicated procedure, but not anymore. CSS3 has made adding box shadows as easy as adding text. That's actually very true. I'm going to go ahead and refresh, go back, refresh this. Let's load up number 2. I have to save exercise 2 first. Save it. Let's go and refresh. There we go. So now we've got that information on there, but we want to add a box shadow to this. There's actually a couple different ways that we can do this in CSS. I'm just going to come up under my style tags. And again, I'm only using the embedded styles because it's just easier. We're just working with one particular item, so I don't really need to add an external style sheet. Again, we're going to add a border. And again, I'm adding this border this time just so you can actually see exactly what makes up our box. Make it a solid line, and I'm going to give it a black outline. Again, use this way, it gives you an idea what you can see. I'm going to add some padding so it's easier to see the text inside. I'm going to go 5 pixels, top and bottom, 10 pixels left and right. And then we're going to add a box shadow. And here we're going to use that box shadow property inside of CSS3. It's going to be 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 5 pixels, and we'll talk about all these settings in 1 minute. And the line, or the color, I'm just going to use a dark gray. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes, refresh my browser window, and now you can actually see we've got this nice shadow. Let's add some additional spacing. I'm just going to add some margin on the left and right here, so we can get it away from the edge. That's all I'm doing. So I'll go 0 top and bottom. Let's go 25 pixels left and right, just to get it away from the top and bottom of the, or get it away from the edges of our screen so you can actually see the full shadow. This way you can see that full shadow that's coming around that box. But this box shadow is created specifically using the box shadow property inside CSS. And We've got a bunch of different values in here. Let's talk about what these values are. So inside the box shadow property, I have an H shadow, which is the horizontal shadow. Negative values, by the way, are allowed in here, but this is the horizontal offset of the shadow. Then I've got the vertical shadow offset, and you notice I got 10 pixels, 10 pixels. I could make these 5 pixels and 5 pixels. If I were to save that change, you'll notice they're going to come in a little bit. They're not going to be as deep as they are. And you'll notice they both came in. Could make them 15, so you could actually get, in other words, get a much better idea of how these are actually working. Save the change, refresh the browser window, and now you'll see they've offset even deeper. This 5 is the amount of blur, which is an optional setting, but it's the amount of blur that we're using in the actual shadow itself from our shadow color. If I made that 15, save the change, refresh the browser window, and you notice it got much blurrier. We tend to try to keep this kind of sharp. That's why you noticed I had it set at 5. A lot of times I'll actually leave this off, or I'll leave it at 1 or 2 because I actually want the shadow to be very sharp. And now you notice we had very sharp lines on that shadow itself. I made it a 2 pixel blur, which is pretty much next to no blur at all. 15 is kind of high for these though, so I'm going to take these back down to 10 to get a realistic shadow, because normally we don't have that much space between our item and the shadow itself. There are some other optional values that can go in there. We could have a spread value, which is the size of the shadow, and again, negative values are allowed. We could actually put the color option, which we did because we're using the dark gray. That's optional also. Normally it would be black. Inset is also optional. It's another value that can go after color. It changes the shadow from an outer shadow to an inner shadow. So, I mean, we got a couple optional values, and we also have the values that we're using here. I did not use the spread, I used the blur instead. I did use the color, but I did not use inset. This is very, very simple as compared to how they used to be. It used to be quite difficult to put box shadows around elements inside HTML. With CSS3, the new box shadow property makes it relatively easy to add box shadows, and you can add box shadows to almost any item that you put on. I could actually put a box shadow around my H2 if I wanted to. I mean, I could actually add a box shadow to the H2 element. Because keep in mind that the H2 element is a box level element. I'm just going to say 10, 10, and I'm going to leave the blur blank, and I'll just give it a color of dark gray. Save the change, refresh the browser window, and you'll notice now I've got this box shadow, or the shadow around the H2 element itself. And keep in mind, because it's a block level element, that's why you're seeing it go around the whole element. Because again, I'm having it display as box level. If I actually wanted it to just be around the actual length of the text, I could say display inline block, and then it would shorten it just the line of the text. Doesn't look very good there because of the way we've got the text set up. There is another value new in CSS3 called text shadow, and we'll cover that in a later tutorial, which you can actually do text shadowing now in CSS3, which again used to be very, very difficult to do with the older CSS styling languages. CSS3 has made it very simple now to add that also. Okay, so next thing we're going to look at is let's look at the border image property. This is the one that's not been implemented well across the different browsers yet. By the way, box shadow and the border one that we looked at earlier, the border radius, very well supported across all the different browsers. Up to this point, I mean, I have not found any implementations yet across the newer browsers that don't utilize it the way it's meant to be used. So it's working very well across all the different browsers. Image, the background image, not so much, but again, they're catching up on it, and it's not really something that I would use a lot anyway. I don't know too many people that actually use background images inside their borders. Normally, if we're going to do that, we're going to have a fixed size cell, and we're actually going to have a fixed background, usually with a background image also, and that's how we'd use that. But anyway, let's go ahead and demonstrate the background image in CSS3. All right, so let's go ahead and move into our last example. We're actually going to do this graphic, this image for our border, which is another new feature in CSS3, very cool feature. Again, something that used to take us a lot of code to do in the old days. Not so much anymore. I'm going to go ahead and take this section out here that we were working on in the previous exercise. I'm going to go ahead and pull out that HTML. Let's go do a save as. I'm going to save this as example number 3. I'm going to go ahead and add some new HTML. So inside my body section, I'm just going to go ahead and paste this in so you don't have to watch me type it. I've just basically added a new H2, and it's adding a background image for a border. And then I've got this new section in there that says adding a background image. Used to be a very complicated procedure, and it was when we were adding images to our borders. CSS3 has made adding the border backgrounds very easy. Again, with the changes to CSS3, it has become quite simple to do this. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Let's go refresh our browser and get on that example number 3. And you can see what we've got here. And basically what I have is just a paragraph talking about this background image. Now I'm going to go up into my styles and add some styles into my embedded style tags. So I'm going to target the actual section itself, and that's why I use this section ID. I want to actually target that section as being what I'm going to actually add my border to. So I've got a couple settings in here that are going to pertain to the graphic I used. And so you're aware, what I did use is I used a graphic that I created inside of my Firefox, my graphic editor. It's just an 80 by 80 pixel graphic. I'll show it to you when we complete the exercise. But it's actually similar to how we would use sprites in CSS if you've gotten familiar with using sprites in CSS. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my border. And because this is going to be a graphic, I'm going to set the border up as 15 pixels wide, solid, and transparent. That's probably not a setting that you've used before, transparent, because it's not a setting that we normally use with a border. Normally we're putting a color in there, but because I want a graphic to appear, I'm just giving the border the width of the actual graphic that I've designed for this particular exercise, and I'm making the border itself transparent so that graphic will show through. Then I want to give it the width itself of the actual border, and for this particular exercise I'm just going to make 350 pixels because it's a good size inside this browser window. You can make that whatever width you want based on what your content was set at. I'm going to set up my padding, and again I'm using the padding as we've done in the previous exercises just to push the text in so it's easier for you to see what's going on. 10 pixels top and bottom, 20 pixels left and right. And then I'm actually going to set up the border image. So I'm going to say border dash image. The first thing we have to give it is the URL. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my colon, type URL, and then in parentheses, I actually have this image stored in the root with this actual document. So I'm just going to call it border.png. That's the actual name of the file that I created that contains my image. Then I'm going to give it my offsets, 30, 30, and round. And let me explain what those mean. That first 30 is the image slice, the inwards offset of the image border. So I've got an image slice and image width, and that's basically what I've put in there. It's basically telling it where to position that sprite inside my image, and you'll see what I mean as soon as we look at the image. And if you work with sprites, you understand this. We actually have a couple different things we can have in there. We can have the source, which we have right there, the source of the actual file itself for the graphic. Then we have the slice, the width, the outset, repeat, initial, and inherit. And again, these are all properties that we can put inside this property. The one that we use, obviously, we're going to use the URL because we want the image itself. And normally we're going to use the slice and the width, so where that actual image is going to appear. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser window, and you can see now how the images appeared inside of the browser. And again, just from using this little PNG image, let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Fireworks and show you what the image looks like so you can see what we're working with here. And basically it's this little 80 by 80 pixel image that I have, and that 15 pixels is the offset. The 30 pixels that I'm using is the offset to actually locate these. What's cool is you'll notice that when I say round, I only get the corners, and then everything in between is that actual nice little orange graphic that I have right in the center. If I were to make this stretch, which is another one of the settings that we can use here, then we're only going to see one of the center images. Let me go ahead and save the change, refresh the browser window, and it actually stretches that one center image all the way out to each corner, which is kind of cool. You can actually have round or stretch in there depending upon how you want your graphic to be displayed. But I thought that was kind of a neat feature inside CSS3. Anyway, this is, again, saved us a lot of time in how we used to do this in the old days. And this has been pretty well supported. What I've got right now, I've got this actually opened up in Google Chrome. Let's go ahead and look at this in Firefox. So you can actually see it up in Firefox. It's pretty much the same as it was. I've got the same thing loaded. I'm going to bring it up in Internet Explorer. Let's go ahead and refresh it. And again, you'll notice it's very, very similar to how it appeared in the other ones. Go ahead and make this round again so you can actually see what the round looks like. But it's very well supported in all of our browsers, to include Opera. I mean, I thought I was going to have some problems with this because when I actually originally wrote this exercise, I was seeing some compatibility issues with some of the other browsers. But since I've updated it, and it's been probably about a month ago since I wrote this and came back to actually finish this group of tutorials. So with those updates in those browsers, they are now addressing this border image, and it's pretty cool. I mean, it's a pretty cool feature inside of CSS3. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you watch the rest of the series, because we're going to go through each one of the different changes in CSS3 and how they can really speed up your development process in websites.